In her library at Pleasant View, Mrs. Eddy placed a depiction of the imprisoned Daniel responding to the king.
"So many years to be before the jaws of beasts, as I have been," she wrote the student who gave her that engraving, "is more than Daniel's experience." But she told a visitor, "You see, he has turned his back on the lower or bestial elements of mortal mind and is giving his answer to the king, to the highest. That is what I have always done."
In 1906, brutal animosity to Mrs. Eddy and the religion she led was finding new voices. Doctors of medicine were planning a national assault against Christian Science. Revered preachers and respected authors made vicious attacks on its discoverer and leader. One of the leading powers of the press, Joseph Pulitzer, snarled at all Christian Scientists. His voice would turn out to be the most ominous of all. In 1906, McClure's magazine was preparing to launch what they called an exposé of the leader of Christian Science, based on a pile of material collected by one Georgine Milmine. Publisher Sam McClure had hired the promising young author Willa Cather and put her to work sifting through Milmine's notes to write a series of biographical articles defaming Mrs. Eddy. Pulitzer and the editors at his daily New York newspaper, The World, got wind of the story. To scoop McClure's, Pulitzer staff conceived an Eddy exposé of their own. Their new story peg would be that Mother Eddy, as they called her, was sick, dying, or dead, and that someone in her inner circle was impersonating her in carriage rides around town, an imposter they referred to as her dummy. The World sent two top reporters to Concord to dig up whatever they could find to flesh out that story. Sunday, October 14th, the reporters knocked on the door at Pleasant View and demanded to see for themselves whether Mrs. Eddy was alive or not. They were invited to return on Monday to meet her. The following afternoon, the men arrived, bringing a neighbor who verified that it was indeed Mrs. Eddy herself. She spoke with them briefly, then excused herself to return to her work. Apparently satisfied, the men left. Two weeks later, the World broke its story on the front page of its Sunday edition. The reporter's version of their encounter with Mrs. Eddy was a total fabrication, claiming she looked more dead than alive. Column after column went on in that sensational vein. The World had scooped Sam McClure. Its headlines sold a lot of papers, readers were enthralled, and the lions were loosed. In December, McClure's began its series of 14 installments that would eventually become a defamatory book, full of misinformation. In sermons, lectures, pamphlets, detractors pounced on Mrs. Eddy and the religion she had founded. Harper's Publishing Company decided the time was ripe to put out a hardcover version of Mark Twain's essays ridiculing Mrs. Eddy. A book by Reverend Lyman Powell savaged her and her religion. Later, Powell would learn better and write a biography that lauded Mrs. Eddy, but for now, he joined in the attack. The feeding frenzy was headlined in The World, with stories depicting her as if she were in physical and mental decline. None of this had anything to do with the truth of the matter, which was confirmed by all who visited Pleasant View. Far from being dead, Mrs. Eddy was hard at work for her cause.
At that time, she was revising Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She had a copy of the $3 edition taken apart in sections. She would take off one section at a time and go through it. Clara Knox McKee.
That fall, as the New York World attacked her, she and her secretaries were in the final stages of proofreading. In January 1907, Mrs. Eddy's last major revision of Science and Health came off the presses on schedule. Meantime, the turmoil in the press headed in a new direction. 2 days after the first article appeared in the World, Mrs. Eddy had met briefly with 11 journalists in the parlor before going on her daily drive. Mrs. Eddy's very presence, facing that room full of reporters, exposed the lie that she was dead or dying, or that a fake was impersonating her in her carriage. That meant Pulitzer's paper had to create a fresh angle for its headlines. Their new story would publicize a lawsuit seeking control of Mrs. Eddy's finances and charging her household and church officers with looting her assets. The World itself concocted the lawsuit declaring her mentally incompetent to manage her own affairs. The suit would be brought on her behalf purportedly by family members referred to by the legal term her next friends.
Nexters, Mrs. Eddy would call them.
As lead counsel, the World retained noted political figure, United States Senator from New Hampshire, William Chandler. His first task was to recruit family members willing to put their names on the suit as Mrs. Eddy's next friends. The same reporter who had visited Concord was sent across the country to lay the case before her son, George Glover. As a boy in New Hampshire, George had been taken from her and raised by farm people, who then moved with George to the far west. Now in his 60s, married with several children and living in South Dakota, George had seen his mother only during a few visits to Boston. Over the years, Mrs. Eddy and her son had corresponded, and she had showered generous gifts on him and his family, including building him the finest house in his city. George, poorly educated, naive, and in perpetual need of money, was won over by Chandler's letter, which raised alarm that his mother's wealth was being drained away by her staff against her will, and that a vast estate might be lost to him as her heir. By December, George and his daughter Mary had signed on as next friends and were in Washington, D.C. conferring with Chandler, who also rounded up other relatives to join the suit. In March 1907, the case was filed in New Hampshire, and the New York World had its new headline story. In court, Chandler set about to establish that Christian Science itself was a form of dementia. Hence, Mary Baker Eddy was suffering insane delusions.
The poor woman is crazy. William Chandler.
The suit threatened to take Mary Baker Eddy's assets out of her hands and place them in a trust to be named by the next friends. It was religious persecution, plain and simple.
She said this was wickedness, trying to discredit her in the eyes of the world, in the hope of ending her living leadership as the pioneer Christian Scientist. Joseph Mann.
What was at stake called for a strong metaphysical defense. Mrs. Eddy instructed her household how to meet the challenge metaphysically.
She told them, "The hour is the acme of hate against love, and love alone can meet it. There is no law but the divine, and this law reigns and rules this hour."
Plunging into an active, practical defense of her place as leader, she wrote in a flowing hand to the judge,
"This suit was brought without my knowledge and is being carried on contrary to my wishes," she said. "The present proceedings test my trust in divine love."
She gave directions to her lawyers, invited civic leaders in for visits, granted interviews to journalists, and even solicited testimony from psychological doctors. All who came in contact with her reported her to be as intelligent, vigorous, and gracious as ever. In the face of the obvious facts about Mrs. Eddy's health and state of mind, it's remarkable that so many knowledgeable newsmen, ministers steeped in Bible study, a world-famous author, a prominent statesman and lawyer were taken in by blatant falsehoods. Even her own well-meaning son.
She wrote George, "I love you, my only child. Why do you allow yourself to be used to bring this great grief and trouble on your own aged mother?
What possessed such people to be so deceived by fakery and so obsessed with destroying Christian Science and its leader?
Truth, Christ, has come so near to this age that error is rampant to save itself from destruction, is the way Mrs. Eddy read the situation, saying, evil is venting itself, and when found out will have done with itself what needs to be done.
She turned her thoughts upward from threats of evil, like the upturned face of Daniel in the picture on her wall. A visitor recalled,
she would leave her work for a few minutes and come and stand before this picture and study anew the calm manner in which Daniel paid no heed to the lions or seeming danger, letting his dear Heavenly Father care for the ferocious beasts and keep them at a safe distance. With new and fresh courage, she said she would return to her work with a heart full of joy and gratitude for his protecting care. Reverend Severin Simonson.
In court, a judge, a psychologist, and a lawyer were appointed as a committee of masters to interview Mrs. Eddy and report on her mental competence. After months of briefs and counter-briefs, the masters' hearings were to commence in Concord on Tuesday, August 13th.
Mrs. Eddy asked her student, Professor Herman Herring, then first reader in the Concord Church, to attend each session and report to me daily how goes the battle.
The very first hearing was postponed because the judge was taken ill. I reported this to Mrs. Eddy, and she was very much disturbed. Herman Herring.
This called for specific treatment through prayer. I want a strong thought, Mrs. Eddy told Professor Herring. Oh, for the spiritual understanding that knows it is all governed by God, infinite truth and love.
Her student Julia Prescott in Massachusetts was selected to do this specific prayerful work. Professor Herring went by train and carriage to bring her to Concord.
She dropped everything and came immediately, began work at once, and the next day the judge was well, and the trial continued. Herman Herring.
The judge and the other court-appointed masters scheduled their interrogation of Mrs. Eddy at her home in deference to her age. Next friend's lawyer, Chandler, Mrs. Eddy's lawyer, and a stenographer would accompany them.
Mrs. Eddy told us we must know that no one could hurt us, nor be made to, and that we could not hurt anyone, nor be made to, that we could not hurt ourselves, nor be made to. And God loves and helps us all. Julia Prescott.
The next day was hot. Mrs. Prescott recalls,
on the morning we expected the masters to come to Pleasant View to examine our leader, she said to one of her secretaries, tell Minnie to make the best lemonade for them that she ever made, and I want them to use the Bohemian glasses.
The secretary suggested these men would do better with her set of ordinary cut-glass tumblers, which were larger.
Dear Mrs. Eddy looked disappointed and said, I only wanted them to have the best. Julia Prescott.
That set the tone for the whole encounter. The men trooped in at 2 o'clock and were ushered upstairs. There they spent the next hour or so with a gracious hostess who turned the interrogation into something like a neighborly afternoon chat over a pitcher of Minnie Wygant's best lemonade served in man-sized tumblers. They were also served a good helping of Mrs. Eddy's common sense and spiritual insight. After they trooped out, the exasperated Chandler was clearly heard saying,
she's sharp as a steel trap.
The lawsuit that had swollen so large deflated like a punctured balloon. Chandler simply withdrew it. When Mrs. Eddy received word that the case had collapsed, she spread her hands in a familiar gesture of thanks to God.
Almost at once, she turned to her desk and wrote a letter of overflowing forgiveness to one of those in whose name the suit had been brought, Calvin C. Hill.
Later, she revised a passage in Science and Health to read, "Friends will betray and enemies will slander, until the lesson is sufficient to exalt you. For man's extremity is God's opportunity." And still later added, "The author has experienced the foregoing prophecy and its blessings." Like Daniel, she could report, "My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me."